Durkheim.
You
Now,
don't really like Durkheim, do you? Did I read that right? That you've got doubts about Durkheim?
well, Durkheim is particularly irritating because I really don't like him, and I think
Yeah.
he's hugely hyped up, partly because he was formerly the founder of sociology, and so most sociologists make a big thing of him, people like Tony Giddens and others,
Mm.
but because he's the founding father, or in many ways. But I think he was a second-rate intellectual, and I think he was enormously ethnocentric. He really knew nothing except about France, the 19th century onwards, and little bits of anthropology which he read. I mean, didn't consider the rest of the world. He didn't know much about Britain. He didn't know much about history, as far as I can see. So he was a very narrow thinker. But what's annoying about him is that he did actually have some very good ideas, one or two good ideas. I keep stumbling over and then thinking, oh God, I've got to say something nice. So what was right and wrong about him? Well, he was exactly facing the same problem as Marx. That is to say, he was, like Marx, a secularized Jew. He was someone who'd lost the underpinning of his cosmology. He saw around him a society where religion no longer held it together, for him personally and for the rest of society. He saw a society where the state was weak. He saw a society where individuals were increasingly alone. The family system had collapsed, and the Jewish family system, like all the rest. And he gave a good name to this anomie. And he said the result is disaster. And he made a famous study of one effect, which is suicide, his great book on suicide. He says one of the three forms of suicide is caused by anomie, caused by rootlessness, another word for it. Basically, why should we go on living when no one cares? You know, you wake up in the morning and you think, well, who would notice if I was dead? No one. No one cares. Okay, jump over the bridge. So basically, rootlessness and anomie and alienation of the Marxist kind, and a futile sort of civilization, not held together by anything, is what we face. So what are we going to do about it? Now, why I had a grouse against him was that he does sort of ask the good question, which is, what are we going to do about it? But he comes up with 3 or 2.5 solutions, which are totally ludicrous. They're not as harmful. I'm being very forthright here, and I hope my YouTube watchers will realize I'm just speaking off the top of my head, and if they love all these people, they should just say, oh, there's Alan ranting again. But basically, he said that the solutions, one solution was that we should integrate people basically through making them feel they are contributing to their society and therefore they are worth something, overcome anomie and alienation by the division of labor. He wrote a famous book called The Division of Labor and Society. And the idea was that very simple societies, and this is one of the ideas I really like about him, very simple societies are based on the idea of a kind of segmentary earthworm with everyone doing the same thing. I've talked about this before. And that modern societies are based by the division of labor between people who do this and that. And we see this more and more, that, you know, every action we take, you know, you are part of a team or an integrated supply chain or wherever it is. And so basically, and this was a big theme in Adam Smith, that the progress of civilizations is through the division of labor. We divide up tasks. And modern society is characterized by that division of labor. And his one solution was that if we can tell people, okay, you're sitting at a checkout desk day after day in a supermarket. Now, your life may seem a bit trivial and boring and pointless, but remember what you're doing. You are helping the great consumer revolution. You are kindly helping the consumers who come through and the customers, and you are contributing this way and that. So feel good about it, and all will be well. So through a sort of, and this was related to his idea about medieval guilds, that if you can build up the guild structures and the structures of cooperative work and division of labor and so on like that. So this was part of a French movement at the end of the 19th century, the syndicalists movement. So basically, if you can tell people how worthwhile their work is as part of the division of labor in society, then we will have solved the problem. I've never tried on a checkout. Next time I go to Sainsbury's or Tesco's, I'll try this. If the person is looking particularly sad and frustrated, I will say, "Have you read Durkheim on the division of labor?" I expect they'll say, "Well, what does he say?" And I suspect after explaining, they'll say, "Well, it doesn't make me feel much better, I'm afraid." So basically, it's not, it's useful in pointing out that we are very different from normal societies in our division of labor. And it's useful in that I have argued that teamwork and play and being with other people and being part of something bigger is some solace and worthwhile, but it's not a solution to the big problems of the 19th or 20th century. So he then moved on to his second solution, which was to the existential crisis of religion, basically, the meaning of life questions, because this division of labor doesn't address that. And here he did something similar to Marx and Rousseau and others, said, well, let's go back to the simplest case, this very simplest society, and see what they do about giving meaning to their lives. And for him, he's writing a little after Marx, and some very good work in anthropology is being done by some people, particularly in Australia, Spencer and Gillen and one or two others, on Australian Aboriginal religion and society. And this work, which he read in the beginning of the 20th century, described how hunters and gatherers, who were very anomic and individualistic and lived scattered around the Australian outback in very small family groups. But from time to time, every few years, they would all come together in a corroboree, I think it's what it's called. And for some weeks or months, they would have a wonderful party, a sort of pop festival, as it were, of the time, a Glastonbury in the desert. Basically, they would accumulate lots of food and drink and their local religious experts, and they would dance and they would sing and they would tell the myths, and they would fuse together. They would cause a kind of religious wave around them, which would, and they would regenerate another world above them with their myths and their story and their song lines, and they would tell all the old myths and the ancestors and everything. So they would create a supernatural world which would give meaning to their daily lives and corroborate and validate all this. And then they would go off and spend next few years wandering around, but sort of feeling better after their summer folk festival. And so he said, this is what they do. And this is what modern people like Marx and others have shown us. Religion is a projection of this world. We make our gods, and we do it through our social activities. And he made the distinction between the sacred, which is things set apart and the secular. We create sacred spaces which then generate through collective euphoria this, and then this is the purpose of rituals and myths and religion and so on. So this is fine, and we need this. Now, the 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 weakness, of course, is the same one as Marx, which is it's fine for a few hundred individuals in the middle of a desert, or it's even fine for a folk festival. But if you went on behaving as you did at Glastonbury for the rest of the year, you pitched your tents in your business quarters, and you smoked a bit of this and that, and had your loud music and so on, things would go wrong. In other words, it's a moment out of space and time, and you can't build a society on that kind of activity. So he never even attempted to show how you take that world and plonk it in the middle of early 20th century Germany, and as the war is building up, which is when he was writing. I mean, there are elements of it, of course, which you can take, and the Third Reich is a very good example. I mean, Hitler's antics with his mass parades and so on is a modern equivalent of whipping up this frenzy of hysteria and mass emotion to generate a new ideology and so on. So it's a pretty good technique for political parties and so on. And Donald Trump's rallies are a more recent example of this. But basically, it's not a way you can solve the problems of modern society. So I think Durkheim, this is in many ways, this weakness of Durkheim is sad, because as the founding father, alongside Marx, modern sociology is based on these foundational figures, Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. And I'll mention Weber in a moment. But two of them are more or less useless as foundational figures. This is why sociology, as I watched it in the later half of the 19th century, disintegrated. I mean, there were many flaws in every discipline, including anthropology, but one of my closest friends, Geoffrey Hawthorne, wrote a book which sort of summarized it. It was a textbook for schools, and it was called Enlightenment and Despair. It didn't go down very well as a textbook, because it was filled with despair. Mm. And he stopped being a sociologist, and others in Cambridge who had been very attracted because of the attraction of Marx and Durkheim, and attraction of a discipline which paid attention to ordinary people, which was part of the spirit of that age. Sociology was really the big up and coming discipline, because it paid attention to the weak and the poor and the women, and it taught us about how we are connected. So it was a really good, exciting discipline. And yet the intellectual foundation, as he shows and others have shown, was wafer thin.